How's everybody doing? Good?
Good.
Good. So, Brian, it seems like when we've talked about some of these things before, you've got a bit of an axe to grind, maybe a chip on your shoulder about some of the scholarly approach to some of this stuff. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's more about like closed-mindedness that's really getting to me. And it's like the idea that like if you can't prove something, then it doesn't exist. It's like the whole aspect that like atheism roots from. Like, oh, you can't prove God, therefore it doesn't exist. But some of that same mentality, not among all scholars, of course, me and Zhang get along most of the time.
Yeah, I feel like I have to defend my fellow scholars, although I am also a believer in mystical things. So,
right, yeah, you're very balanced there, and I think that you do get those. Many of the scholars, I can't group them all in. We can't speak in absolutes. Only Sith deal in absolutes.
Which would make Obi-Wan the master of the high ground.
Right. So maybe it's best giving kind of an example.
Yeah, like what sorts of things have you encountered this with?
Like for example, like if you were to ask like a mainstream scholar, is there any connection between Norse mythology and Christianity, Jesus dying on the cross? And a few points to make is Jesus dies on a tree or a cross, depending on what gospel account you read. He gets pierced by a spear, and then he promises to return again and have like a second coming and set the world right, and he becomes the father of creation with that purchase, right? And then you have Odin in Norse mythology, the All-Father, and he hangs himself on a tree to get great wisdom, and then he gets pierced by his own spear while he's on the tree. and you'll ask a scholar and say, no, missionaries went to the Norse people, and there was a few of them that started in the 8th or the 9th century, but it got really big, their missionary efforts in the 10th and 11th century. And I can completely honor the research that they've done to show this was an organized religious expedition, missionary outreach. I get that. It's good to know that. I can respect that, and that's why I listen to scholars. But then they'll say there is zero connection between Christianity and Norse mythology. And part of me is like, are you freaking kidding? Look at there's more connections than that even.
Yeah. Let me speak to that a little bit, if I may. So, we may not through traditional historical method be able to see any trail. It's a chicken and an egg thing, right? Mm-hmm. So if we can't see a trail, then we can't speak to it. And yeah, you're going to get scholars that are going to say only from what you see is what you believe. If there's no evidence of a trail of a connection between the Norse mythology going back earlier to Christianity, or if the Norse is even earlier, I'm not trained in that specific realm, but the approach would be in a different area. So some of us will do like a belief studies or like cultural studies. And from there, we could say, yeah, there's some clear parallels because this culture believes that and this one believes that. Now that's stepping away from the historical record because we don't have all those trails. You have the one that you talked about with the missionaries coming in, and they're able to say, okay, there's a connecting point, but we don't see anything before that. But you can definitely draw some parallels with the allegories and the archetypes.
And that's why I enjoy you and why I appreciate you. And thanks for all that. Like some more details though, like why I may part ways with some of the more rigid minds, if that makes sense, is you have a freaking 1,000 years in between, arguably, because Christianity comes from the 1st century. Mm-hmm. And then if you can get into other modalities of science and studies, like you were kind of suggesting there, you can show that people had the boat building technology to sell at that time. They found those kind of things that people had means of getting all over. And it becomes like if you look at it through the lens of like a mathematical probability, it can be very clear that you don't just lock down every people of every nation to where they weren't allowed to leave. And there's more of a probability that people have several people from their country wander to other countries. There's evidence of that.
But you have at least some kind of cross-pollination happening. Like, one bit of evidence for this is that we're still biologically compatible. Like, we're not 5 different subspecies of humans that are not biologically compatible. Like, more or less, everybody on the planet is, not to make this a sex joke, but could conceivably have children. Like, it's not, we're not so divided. And if we were as divided as scholars have sometimes insisted or suggested, after enough time, you would instead have like several subspecies of humans that wouldn't be able to produce fertile offspring.
Right.
That's kind of taking the a scholar technique of saying like, hey, if this, then explain it. And, you know, kind of sitting in the middle on scholars versus intuition. I don't know what the right word for the other side of the table is. I think it's good to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out.
Right.
Yeah, in the scholar's defense, I will say there needs to be some more humility, right? Because in the scholar's defense, we're working
we know everything.
with,
well, no, you don't.
Yeah, we're working with really scant materials. The further back you go, the less written record there is. So when you start to look at archaeology, you're making a lot of assumptions and guesses anyway. So, we use intuition a lot ourselves without calling it that. And then we build off of that and making some theories. Now, the more times you see something, the stronger a theory will be. A theory is not just a will-o'-the-wisp idea. There's as much backing to that as possible. But we get on our own hobby horses, we get convinced about that, and then we think it's the rock-solid truth, and then some other thing comes along and you see an article about, there really was one of the King David's generals in the army because they just found a coin from him or something. So
Interesting.
And it upends the whole record.
Yeah, I think the core crux of the part that like bothers me, and it's a few, and Graham Hancock makes some of these same points too, but like the absence of evidence isn't always evidence. It's especially when you go into an area and you realize that you've only discovered 10% of what's out there, or 5%, or 3%. It just seems like it's a complete ego trip when people go into this could never be. And they make absolutes of the not, of the no, of the negative.
Because a lot in the scholarly community, and I'm not super schooled in this or trained in this, but just from layperson's knowledge, like they dispute whether there was a person called Moses and whether that person ever lived in a place called Egypt. Like no one disputes that Egypt exists, right? But there are people who dispute that. And there's plenty of people like you and me that say, well, no, clearly Moses existed. Like I'm not in need of scholarly hard proof of a DNA sample or something that would establish that Moses existed.
Yeah, and you make a good point because we don't know what we don't know. And to use that as a conclusion, to your point, I think is foolhardy. It just means there's more area for research, and it can get really frustrating if something's not available. And sometimes we just won't know through scholarly means some things because there's just nothing to be found that way.
Right. And sometimes, and I bring up the brain, sometimes that gets really left-brained when people get where they have to absolutely engineer and measure every last thing. I get that. And it may sound like I'm poo-pooing on people with left brains, they're left brain dominant, but truthfully, I actually prefer having the discussion with the left brain versus somebody that had zero left brain, because sometimes people can get completely unmeasurable. Like you said, their brain falls out. And
so they're so open-minded that they'll take anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. You talk about balance a lot too. So if you do have some evidence on things and it can be thought through logically, that really supports your intuition and brings it around. But intuition is a playground. You can inject your imagination into it and you can go into a lot of different areas. But
yeah, and I guess I don't feel the need to argue for intuition. I feel like to be clear, like intuition's great if it measures, if it works out, right? There were some people that were getting, they're under fire for visiting a psychic and they were shaming them because it was weird, right? And I was like, well, was the psychic accurate? That was my question.
Like, is how you measure it?
Yeah, like, is it accurate? Yeah, were they right? How can we talk about that? And I know there's some weird things out there, and I had an uncle that was always talking about like Nikola Tesla and saying that he got a lot of his ideas and he claimed he got them from aliens, and I'm like, well, the guy invented stuff that works. As crazy as it sounds, like, can we get a product that is functioning? Yeah. even if you have some crazy story behind it, I can deal with a crazy story if the technology works, right? So
yeah, and I think in this channel you talk a lot about measuring things as well by the stars, and you have something outside of the scholar's tools to be able to give you another point for logic and reasoning, because you can't make up the coincidences, and they're more than coincidences at times.
Yeah, when you start getting something that's a math, and you get the whole, like a story, and it goes through the whole zodiac in order 12 times, you start to get into the probabilities of...
If you get one hit, sure, coincidence.
Yes,
you get two even. You know, that's a more suspicious coincidence. When you get 3 and then they're in a row and then you get more than that.
Yeah.
What's the random monkeys things on creating a dictionary if have that many monkeys in a
row? Well, I'm at peace with this. We good?
Yeah. Sounds good.